Hi, everyone. This is a recording of a sermon that I gave earlier on our Zoom worship. This is for people who want to watch the sermon but weren't able to worship with us this morning. We heard Matthew's version of the story of the banquet, the wedding banquet. Matthew says that the kingdom of heaven is like a king who invites all of his friends to the banquet and they can't come. And in Matthew's version, the people who can't come abuse and murder the servants who deliver the invitation. So the king gets mad, and then he goes back and destroys those murderers and burns their cities. And then he invites everyone from the streets and alleys and cities and towns all around. And the banquet is open to everyone who can come. That's the part of the story that we're most familiar with. And I'm guessing it's the part of the story that we like. Then Matthew goes on to tell this very perplexing piece about the person who comes to the banquet who does not have a wedding garment. And because he is not wearing a wedding garment, the host throws him into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. We don't like that part of the story either. So I promise I'm going to come back to the wedding garment at the end. But what I want to say is that the differences between Matthew's version of the story and Luke's remind us that each evangelist brings their own stuff to their telling of parables that Jesus told. And Matthew is coming from a place of trauma, maybe not Matthew personally, but the Christian community of which he is a part and to whom he is writing is a community born from a culture of blame and mistrust, from the trauma of the destruction of the temple, from the trauma of stories handed down about the death of Jesus. All the judgment stories belong to Matthew. The stories of sorting the sheep and the goats, the fish of every kind, the putting things into categories, that's a Matthew thing. It comes from the wisdom tradition, but it also comes from the trauma of his own tradition. All of this trauma, this community trauma, is related to lack of trust. So what do? Do we get to throw out Matthew's version because we don't like it? Unfortunately, no. Fortunately, there's something to be learned from Matthew's version of this story about the wedding banquet. I think that this is especially true for any of us who have had an experience of past trauma. This morning, I'm not talking about individual trauma, I'm talking about collective trauma. Let's just say, hypothetically, that you are in a community that has experienced collective trauma. You may have come into your faith community from another parish where there was a sense of broken trust or lack of support. You might be in a faith community that had an experience in recent years of getting very, very excited about calling a new priest. And maybe that new priest turned out to be a mismatch or worse. Maybe it was much worse than a mismatch. That might make it very hard for that community to get excited about another new priest. Maybe you felt like trust was betrayed even higher up the food chain in the church because of a lack of understanding or a lack of support. perhaps there's a sense of collective trauma that comes from the loss of so many people moving on from your parish, regardless of the reasons. There's a sense of being diminished. When we have been hurt, either by circumstances or by a person, it is hard to accept the invitation of the king in the story to a feast of rich food and of all good things. The feast that is the kingdom of God is all about abundance. Trauma and the broken trust that can happen in a community, particularly in a faith community, can lend itself to a mindset of scarcity and anxiety. The invitation to the banquet is an invitation to risk joy. Trauma is about bringing the mistrust of a situation that was born in the past into the present. One of the ways that trauma gets healed, and it's way more complicated than this, of course, but one of the ways that trauma gets healed is to bring the good stuff that we are as a community into the present as well. Let's just say that a faith community has been under stress for at least 10 years and has felt thwarted at every turn, such that someone coming in as a new person might sense a collective mindset of trust and of mistrust and scarcity. Think about all the things that are also true about that community. For one thing, in its current form, the community is made up of the people that truly want to be there. The community has a heart for the poor that never dies. The community is faithful to the call of the gospel to love and serve those in need in a way that many parishes cannot, for a whole bunch of reasons. The community is located in an area that is a cornucopia that never empties of opportunities to serve and to grow. These are things that I hope a community with a history of trauma would bring with them from the past into the present. What I've been saying about community trauma may apply to everyone, but what the banquet story tells us is that God welcomes everyone, all of us, and uses all of our experience, good and bad, in service to the kingdom. I promised that we'd come back to the wedding garment. This is one of the hard pieces of Matthew's version of the banquet story. So what I learned quite recently about the culture of ancient Palestine is that a host, particularly a wealthy host, would have on hand a whole bunch of wedding garments to share with guests who were not privileged enough or wealthy enough or nearby enough to bring their own wedding garment. So providing a wedding garment was a way of providing hospitality. And in this story of the banquet that is like the kingdom of God, it was a way of saying, you are welcome. I'm so glad you are here. Here, make yourself at home. To refuse the wedding garment would be to refuse the hospitality of the king. And in that culture, it would be to shame the king. The closest analogy that I could think of in our culture today was the experience of visiting a mosque in Hebron, which is the location of the tomb of the patriarchs in Israel, Palestine, the place where underneath which we think that Abraham and Sarah and Rebecca and Isaac and Leah and Jacob are all buried. If you're a woman in a group, in order to get in there, you have to put on, they give you these gray hooded capes and they invite you to wear them. You can't go in without wearing them. They're pretty hideous, actually. They reminded some of us of The Handmaid's Tale, especially as we were part of a big group all wearing them. But it was a way of experiencing that holy place and experiencing what the tomb of the patriarchs had to offer in the way of history and just resonance with the whole pilgrimage experience. If I had refused to wear it, I would not have been allowed in. If I had snuck in without wearing it, I would have been kicked out of my ear. So again, in its own way, that garment was a symbol of invitation and belonging, of welcome and grace. The wedding guest in the gospel has perhaps been living through all the trauma that informs Matthew's community. It's hard for him to trust and hard to participate fully in all that the banquet host has to offer. The wedding guest's story asks us to ask ourselves whether we are participating fully in all that God has to offer. Let us feast on all the grace, all the joy, all that awaits us in the kingdom of God.